The door didn't make a sound when it opened. That was the first thing people noticed about Nolan Voss. Not his clothes, not his face, not the quiet way he moved through a room. It was the silence that followed him, like the world held its breath. But on the morning of March 4th, outside the Hargrove and Ellis boutique on Whitmore Avenue in Charleston, nobody was holding their breath. They were watching. A woman in a cream wool coat had just raised her hand. The sound came after. Sharp, flat. The kind that bounces off brick and glass and cobblestone and doesn't stop bouncing for a long time. Nolan didn't stumble, didn't reach for his cheek. He just stood there on the sidewalk with his hands still at his sides, one of them holding a paper coffee cup, and he looked at her, not with rage, not with shame. Just looked. The woman, Beatrice Hargrove, 43, wife of Philip Hargrove III, co-owner of 4 retail locations and a name that opened doors in this city the way money opens everything. Stepped back like she'd touched something hot. "Don't you ever speak to me again," she said. "Do you understand? Don't look at me, don't stand near me, don't breathe in my direction." The people on the sidewalk had their phones out. Most of them didn't know what they'd just seen. What they knew was that a woman in a very expensive coat had just slapped a man in a worn canvas jacket, a man who looked like he hadn't slept somewhere warm in a while, and that the man had not said a single word. Nolan took one breath, set the coffee cup down on the edge of a nearby planter, and walked away. Beatrice Hargrove watched him go. Something moved across her face, not regret, something else. Something closer to the satisfaction of a woman who had never in her life been made to feel small, making sure someone else understood their place. She didn't know his name, she would. Nolan Voss had grown up in the part of Charleston that people who lived on Whitmore Avenue referred to as over there, which was a phrase that contained a whole geography of meaning, most of it impolite. He'd grown up in a house where the windows rattled when trucks passed, and where his mother, June Voss, worked double shifts at the hospital laundry for 22 years without ever calling in sick, because sick days meant no pay, and no pay meant no lights. She used to say, "Nolan, you are not what this street says you are. You are what I made you." He believed her. Not because children always believe their mothers, but because June Voss was the kind of woman who made things true by deciding they were. She scraped together enough to get him into a technical program at Hartwell Community College. He took every scholarship he could find. He worked nights stocking shelves at a distribution center on the east side. He slept 4 hours when he could. He graduated with an engineering degree from Clemson, took a position at a firm in Atlanta, spent 6 years learning every corner of structural design, and then came home to Charleston when his mother's health began to slip. Quietly, the way hard things often begin, before they stop being quiet. By the time he arrived back in the city, he had savings, a reputation in his industry, and a company of his own. Voss Infrastructure Partners, small but growing, with contracts in 3 states. He also had, as of that March morning, a red mark on his face that was already beginning to fade. He hadn't been homeless. He'd been standing outside a boutique where he'd arranged to meet a client, wearing the jacket he always wore when he walked the city on his own time, because it had belonged to his father, and he wasn't ready to stop wearing it. The store's entrance was narrow, and he'd stepped to the side to give a group of women room to pass. Beatrice Hargrove had misread the situation entirely, or perhaps she hadn't misread it at all. Perhaps she'd seen exactly what she wanted to see, a black man in a beat-up jacket, standing too close to the door of somewhere nice, and had decided, in the way she had always decided things, that she was within her rights. She was not, legally speaking, within her rights. She'd committed assault in front of at least 11 witnesses and several phone cameras. But she was Beatrice Hargrove. And in Charleston, that still meant something. His brother Theo found him that evening at the kitchen table in their mother's house, where Nolan had been staying since returning home. June was asleep in the back room. The oxygen machine made its slow, rhythmic sound through the wall. Theo was 4 years younger and built like their uncle. Wide shoulders, a laugh that arrived before he did. But he wasn't laughing now. "I saw it," Theo said, setting his phone on the table between them. "It's been shared about 800 times. Nolan looked at the screen. The video was 37 seconds long. You could see the moment clearly. You could see the coffee cup. You could see his face. "What are you going to do?" Theo asked. "I don't know yet. Nolan, I said I don't know yet." Theo sat down. For a moment, neither of them said anything, and the oxygen machine breathed its measured breath through the wall, and the refrigerator clicked on. She called the police, Theo said. After you left, said you'd been threatening her. Nolan looked up. 2 officers showed up. Derek had already sent them the video. Derek from the coffee shop, he was filming the whole time. They saw it. Talked to her. She said it was taken out of context. Theo shook his head. They let her go. Nolan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Did they get her statement?" "Yeah." "Good." He went to bed at 9. He lay in the dark and listened to the oxygen machine and thought about his mother, who had worked 22 years in a hospital laundry for people who would not have invited her through the front door of their houses. He thought about all the things she had never said about, that all the days she had walked into that building and done the work and come home and made dinner and helped with homework. And not once, let her face show what it must have cost her. He thought about Beatrice Hargrove's expression, that small, certain satisfaction. He did not sleep. The following weeks were harder than he let Theo see. The story circulated, got picked up by a local news blog, then by a larger outlet. Beatrice Hargrove's name appeared several places alongside words like incident and altercation. Her husband's PR team put out a statement. Something about a misunderstanding, something about a difficult day, nothing that contained the words, "I'm sorry." Beatrice herself said nothing publicly. The Hargrove family had deep roots in Charleston's social and business community. Philip Hargrove III had been on the boards of 2 hospitals, a private school, and the city's historic preservation society. His name was on a wing of the Hartwell Arts Center. Nolan's attorney, a woman named Claudette Warren, who had handled his business contracts for 3 years, and who had a way of speaking that made you feel like she was explaining something simple when she was actually explaining something very complicated, advised him on his options. He listened carefully. He made some decisions. He also made some phone calls. One of them was to a real estate developer named Sutton Bell, who owed him a favor from a project in Columbia that had nearly fallen apart before Nolan's team redesigned the drainage system at the last hour. Sutton knew property in Charleston the way some people know weather, instinctively, comprehensively. "The block on Caldwell Street," Nolan said. "The old mill building, who holds that?" Sutton told him. "Is it available?" A pause. "It could be," Sutton said. "Why? What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about building something." June Voss declined faster than the doctors had predicted, or perhaps they had predicted it and just not said so plainly. By May, she was spending most of her days in bed. By June, she could no longer recognize Theo reliably, though she always knew Nolan. She would reach for his hand when he sat beside her and call him by his name and sometimes by his father's name, because they had the same hands. She said, long fingers, wide palms, good for holding things. She died on a Thursday morning in late June, with both her sons beside her, and the windows open and light on the floor. Nolan did not cry at the funeral. He held Theo's arm through the service at their mother's church on Decatur Street, and he nodded to the people who came. The nurses from the hospital, the women from the church, neighbors who had known June for 30 years. He did not cry. He cried once, alone in the parking lot of the church, sitting in his car with his hands flat on the steering wheel. Then he dried his face and went back inside. There was paperwork. There was always paperwork. He handled it methodically, the way he handled hard things, and then he went back to work. The Caldwell Street project moved faster than expected. The old mill building was a 5-story structure with good bones and a history of being overlooked. It sat in a neighborhood that the city's tourism brochures didn't mention. The kind of neighborhood that had everything it needed except investment and attention. Nolan's firm took on the renovation as a partial charitable venture. The top 2 floors would be commercial office space, which would generate revenue. The bottom 3 would house a community health clinic with extended evening hours, a workforce skills center for adults seeking certification in the trades, and a credit union branch that didn't charge check-cashing fees. It wasn't what people had expected him to build. When word got around about the project, a few journalists asked him about it. He said simply that his mother had spent her life working for a healthcare system that had not always treated her like she belonged in it, and that he thought people deserved access to healthcare without having to beg for it or wait 5 hours to be seen. He said it plainly, without drama, looking directly at whoever was asking. The building's groundbreaking was in October. There was a small ceremony. Theo stood beside him. Claudette Warren was there. Sutton Bell brought a bottle of something expensive that Nolan did not open until later. The story ran in the Charleston Post and Courier. It ran in a couple of regional business journals. It found its way online, where it was shared by people who recognized the neighborhood, and people who had gone to school with Nolan, and people who had watched the 37-second video from March and had wondered what became of the man in the canvas jacket. Beatrice Hargrove's name appeared in none of the coverage. Nolan had not mentioned her once. Philip Hargrove III's daughter was getting married in November. Camille Hargrove, 29. Bright, the kind of person her parents had always assumed would carry the family name into rooms they hadn't yet managed to enter, was marrying a man named Brooks Calloway, whose family ran a shipping logistics company out of Savannah. The wedding was being held at the Whitmore Estate, a private property on the edge of the harbor that rented for a sum that most people in Charleston would not earn in a year. It was going to be the event of the fall season. Beatrice had been planning it for 8 months. What Beatrice had not known, had no reason to know, given that she did not follow regional infrastructure news or attend groundbreaking ceremonies in neighborhoods she considered beneath her notice, was that Voss Infrastructure Partners had been quietly retained by the Calloway family 18 months earlier to assist with a major facility expansion in Savannah. What she also did not know was that Brooks Calloway's father, a man named Emmett Calloway, who had built his company from a single delivery van over 4 decades and who had strong opinions about character and conduct, had seen the video from March. Emmett had not said anything about it to his son. He had simply noted it. The wedding morning arrived cold and bright, the harbor flat and silver under a November sky. Guests arrived in cars and boats. There was a string quartet in the entry hall. There were flowers that had been flown in from 3 different places. Beatrice stood at the center of all of it in a way that felt, to her, like her natural position. She had worked for this, for the rightness of this moment, for her daughter's happiness, for the culmination of everything the Hargrove name represented. She felt, for the first time in months, fully like herself. The Calloway family arrived at 11:30. Emmett Calloway was a large man with gray at his temples and a handshake that meant something. He came through the door with his wife on his arm and his son beside him, and behind them, stepping into the entry hall with the same unhurried quiet he'd had on a sidewalk in March, was Nolan Voss. Beatrice Hargrove saw him. The sound she made was not a word. It was the kind of involuntary noise that comes from the body before the mind can intervene. Air leaving the lungs too fast, a sharp intake after. Nolan looked at her, the same way he had looked at her on Whitmore Avenue. Not with rage, not with triumph, just looked, steady and calm, as though this moment cost him nothing. Emmett Calloway shook Philip Hargrove's hand and said, "I don't think you've met our structural engineering partner, Nolan Voss. His firm's been essential to our expansion, sharp as anybody I've met in this industry." Philip Hargrove said something appropriate. His face did not change. He was a man practiced at managing his expression. Beatrice could not manage hers. Nolan extended his hand to Philip. Philip took it. They shook. "Mr. Hargrove," Nolan said. Nothing else, just the name, clean and level. Then he moved through the entry hall toward the rest of the guests, and Beatrice stood in the center of the room she had spent 8 months building around her, and the flowers were still beautiful, and the string quartet was still playing, and her daughter was somewhere upstairs in a dress that had cost more than most people spent on a car, and none of that touched the thing that was happening inside her chest. The wedding went forward. It was beautiful by any measure. Camille cried when she said her vows. Brooks's hands shook in a way that made people smile. Nolan sat in the 3rd row from the back where Emmett had seated the business associates. He did not speak to Beatrice again that day. He shook hands at the reception, ate the food that had been prepared, said something that made Emmett's wife laugh. At one point, near the end of the evening, Camille Hargrove, who knew nothing about March, nothing about videos, nothing about sidewalks and canvas jackets, stopped beside him at the edge of the room and said, with the simple openness of someone in the best mood of their life, "Thank you for being here. My father-in-law says your firm has been incredible to work with." Nolan said, "Your family has a beautiful home." He meant the harbor, the light on it at that hour, not the house itself, though the house was fine. He meant the view of the water, which belonged to nobody, which was just there, the way good things sometimes are. She thanked him. She moved on. He found Theo outside on the terrace where his brother had come to meet him. They stood together for a moment in the cold, looking out at the harbor. You didn't say anything to her, Theo said. No, not even at the end. What would I have said? Theo was quiet. Then, I don't know, something. Theo. Nolan turned to look at his brother. She already knows, that's enough. And it was. Not because Nolan had no anger left. He had some, and it was honest, and it lived in him the way his mother's absence lived in him, present and real, and not going away. But because some accounts settle themselves, not through words or confrontation, but through the simple accumulation of time and work and quiet dignity. Through the health clinic on Caldwell Street that opened its doors in January to 300 appointments in the first month. Through the workforce center where 17 people earned their HVAC certifications in the first cohort, and 12 of them got jobs before the class ended. Through the credit union branch that processed its first mortgage for a family that had been told no by every other lender in the city. Through the fact that Nolan Voss had built something in the neighborhood where his mother had built him, and that it would still be there long after the memory of one morning on Whitmore Avenue had faded from everyone's mind, except hers. He drove home that night through streets he knew the way you know a place you grew up in. By feel, by the small variations in pavement and light, by memory that lives in the body rather than the mind. He passed the church on Decatur Street. He passed the distribution center, where he'd worked the overnight shift 20 years ago. He passed the street where his mother's house still stood, where the windows still rattled a little when trucks went by. He didn't stop, but he looked. Some people spend their whole lives trying to prove something to the world. Nolan Voss had stopped needing the world's proof a long time ago. What he'd needed, he'd gotten from a woman in a small house, who had worked double shifts and never once let her face show what it cost her, who had looked at her son and said, "You are what I made you." He was. And somewhere across the harbor, in a house full of flowers that were already beginning to close for the night, Beatrice Hargrove sat at the edge of her daughter's wedding reception and thought about a man in a canvas jacket who had stood on a sidewalk and not said a single word, and who had not needed to.